An emotional trigger acts as a subconscious block deep in our psyche. And when something triggers us, whether it be something we're aware of or something rather deep in our unconscious that we're not really aware of, and we only become aware of it through the emotions that we feel when encountering it, we can notice that there's usually a string attached to the trigger that leads to something in particular. So the first way we'll talk about it is a thought that triggers you. So a thought will trigger you because obviously you still believe thoughts hold any sort of value in your life, any sort of weight. So if we still have not tackled the belief system that we are not our thoughts, we may be continually sort of bullied by thoughts in the years to come. Because the only way out of thoughts is mindfulness. And mindfulness is the practice of realizing you are not your thoughts. So when a thought triggers you emotionally, it creates a lot of fear inside you and it makes you scared. Notice not necessarily what the thought is telling you, but how that feeling becomes sort of clear in your body. Where do you feel that fear and where do you feel scared as a result of that thought triggering you? It's not necessarily that we have to get rid of that thought, but we have to learn to sit with and not become bullied and pushed into a corner by the emotion of fear. So that's what a thought can trigger us into doing. It can trigger us into acting in a way that is avoidant and into acting in a way where we're not experiencing our life the way we really want to. And I hold an interesting viewpoint in this triggering sort of overthinking relationship, whereas I think each thought that triggers you into fear, into an emotional reaction, is actually trying to set you free. And it's trying to set you free to the idea of that you are not your thoughts. Because think about it, if you deal with bad thoughts, if you deal with thoughts that are irrational and sort of doomsday fear inducing, you are far more likely to question the nature of your thoughts as a result of your suffering than someone who doesn't deal with those thoughts. So those thoughts are trying to trigger you into a sort of freedom. They're trying to trigger you into a mindfulness-based freedom. We can also become triggered by relatively random things. We can become triggered by a commercial due to trauma or due to the past experiences in our lives. We can be triggered in relationships. We can be triggered by what people say. And the string I'm connecting right now is an emotional trigger. So it triggers an emotion inside of us that we don't want to feel. And maybe it's triggering an idea of the future that we don't want to happen. But either way, when the trigger is pulled either by someone's words or by seeing something, and we're feeling those emotions again, that trigger is acting as a sort of point in which we can be free because it can trigger us into freedom or it can trigger us into spiral. And by what I mean by spiral is sort of spiraling into overthinking, into avoidant action, into sort of existing and ruminating in our darkness. If we pay attention, then we can see that when we become triggered, so say you're having a conversation with someone and you have an idea of the future that you're really scared of and you don't want to persist, right? And you've been working on creating distance from this fear because you know it's irrational and you know it's just something that you have to create distance from and not give any life to. So you've been practicing this on your own for quite some time and you're having a conversation with someone and then they mention that as, I don't know, maybe off the whim or maybe they make a joke about it. And all of a sudden you feel that trigger in your body. You feel that same fear, you feel scared, and you feel the emotions sort of existing in your body in a way in which maybe you haven't felt in a while. And this is what a trigger does, right? Because at this very moment, you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to acknowledge it as a trigger, as the same thoughts and ideas of the future that you've been creating distance from for so long. Or you spiral down and you sort of move backwards again as a result of that trigger. You may think, oh, this trigger came to save me. No, the triggers aren't there to warn you and they aren't there to save you. The triggers aren't synchronicity of bad things about to happen in your life. It's actually the opposite. Triggers are opportunities for us to be free. Triggers are opportunities for us to be more desensitized to those irrational fears and anxieties that we've had for so long. When we become triggered emotionally, that's our mind sort of saying, and our actually, it's more our subconscious saying, this is somewhere where you are not free. This is somewhere where you are limited. You know, if it came to it, this is what our mind is sort of communicating with us. is that you can't move through this barrier due to your own fear and due to your own ideas surrounding a certain topic or a certain anxiety or a certain fear. And that's what it's saying. It's saying this is where you are not free. So it's much easier to move through the feeling of that fear than trying to work our way all the way around the circle with our environment or our relationships, trying to mend our world into not triggering us. We have to become desensitized to triggers rather than trying to force the world to not trigger us. Because we will become triggered. Everyone has fears. Everyone has certain levels and degrees of anxiety. People have things that trigger unfortunate and unwanted feelings within them. And you can either make the grave mistake of believing that you could somehow live your life avoiding these triggers and avoiding feeling those dark emotions, or you can realize you have to create a desensitization to these fears and to these triggers. And as a result of being desensitized, you will create a resilience, a mental resilience that will equal your freedom. That will equal your peace of mind, your ability to be happy and joyous without feeling guilty or without falling back into those same destructive mental patterns. That's what happens. We grow a resilience to the triggers and we grow a desensitization to those triggers. So now when those triggers come up, we see them as doorways into being even more free. Another aspect and another way you can sort of look at it is you can say whatever triggers you also controls you. And this I'll break down at sort of two different paradigms. The first one I'll stay emotionally, and that is if a certain fear, if a certain anxiety triggers you so much to the point where it makes you want to hide in your room, it makes you want to turn your back against the world and not sort of face those difficult emotions, if something can trigger you into that, it controls your life. Because where you may have taken path one, now that anxiety has triggered you, that fearful thought has triggered you, now you're going to end up taking path two. So now the path that you chose to walk is not your choice. It's the choice of whatever trigger you have encountered. It's the choice of your trauma, your anxiety, your fear. And this is the grave mistake we definitely can't make. We cannot let fear and anxiety or trauma make any decisions for us. Because when we allow our choices to be tainted by those things, then our life becomes pushed in a certain direction that we don't want it to go. It sort of starts to encapsulate some sort of unconscious karmic system path. And when I say karma, I don't mean karma in the way of we've done bad things and bad things are going to happen to us. I don't mean that at all. What I mean by karma is a sort of different definition. I mean this sort of generational trauma and the unconscious path that happens as a result of not facing those difficult emotions. You know, the sort of destiny that was put in place when you were born, and that destiny may only exist if you don't face those traumas, you don't face that anxiety, you don't face any of the negative and fearful thoughts. That's what happens. We live an unconscious sort of path that the end destination is going to be something we avoided our way to instead of climbed our way to or seeked our way to or created our way through. The next way we can become triggered is obviously the more common version of trigger, right? Someone says something and it makes you angry. And I think it's very important to realize, because this is what a lot of people struggle with in terms of emotional regulation and being more centered and more at peace, is that just because someone says something or just because you see something doesn't mean it's worth an emotional investment. You know, your degree of happiness and your degree of satisfaction and peace in life is often a result of how much you are able to withstand emotionally investing in things that don't really matter. So if someone comments something mean on social media to you, you have two choices. You can let it ruin your day, you can let it affect you, or you can realize this is really minor in the grand scheme of things. Does this really matter? Does this really mean anything to me at all? And what happens is when you start to grow that sort of tolerance as well to not engaging in sort of, ridiculous and petty arguments or negative comments or whatever else, you also grow another desensitization. And that is you grow a certain tolerance and resilience to life itself. What happens when people feel out of control in their lives is because they're emotionally investing in so many different things. That one comment sends them down a fit of anger and rage that they can't get over for 1 or 2 days. That one difficult conversation makes them unwaveringly angry and upset for a week. You know, you guys understand what I'm trying to say. You can't emotionally invest in everything. And rather, you should emotionally invest in your peace of mind. That is far more important. Because truly arguing and becoming triggered by something in a reactive way, it pretty much solves nothing 97% of the time, probably. It solves nothing. It may lead to an argument, it may lead to blowing off some steam, but if we really want to take control of our lives, we control the emotional energy and attention that we're putting into different things. People wonder why they don't have any direction in their lives, and then they're putting all of their energy, all of their emotional direction and attention into a million different things throughout their day. When people create something of themselves, when people create something great in this world, it's because they harnessed that emotional energy and they focused it on a singular thing. Obviously, there's other things that need your emotional investment, relationships, family dynamics, friends, whatever it may be. Your purpose, your job, it doesn't matter. The whole point is that we're bringing awareness and a conscious mindset into our life. We are choosing where to put our emotional energy. And just because something triggers us and makes us upset doesn't mean now that we have to become involved in that thing. There's probably countless people who scroll through social media and their entire feed is filled with things that trigger them into feeling angry, sad, and upset because that's the things they keep interacting with. Every time they see a social media post that makes them angry or upset, they go to the comments and they start arguing with people in the comments. And then I'd be willing to bet these people are also the same that wonder why their life is lacking and why they don't feel a sense of direction. It's because they don't know where they're placing their energy in. They're spending all of their sort of energetic currency into useless little tangents that exist all over. So they're placing their emotional energy in 100 different things instead of placing them in 5 to 10 really good areas that they want to see prosper. In the same way, for example, a social media algorithm can control you as well. Because if a social media algorithm knows how to trigger you, then they know how to get you to engage with their content. They know how to get you to stay on the platform for longer. This is the same way reality works as well. You don't realize it, but when you're constantly looking, when you're constantly in a sort of state of upsetness, whether it's because of what's happening in the world, we're not meant to ignore what's happening in the world, but we also have to be relatively reasonable in seeing that our anger isn't inherently going to solve anything and that we be put to better use emotionally regulating ourselves and then making certain choices whether we want to help a certain cause or whatever it may be. Being angry and being in a disruptive emotional state, always looking for an argument and always existing in a reactive state of being, that doesn't solve anything. It doesn't solve anything for anyone, and it doesn't solve anything for you either. You need to learn that reality and social media in that way are very similar. The stuff that you react with on social media and that way that it's pushed towards you is the same way we see things in reality, not because that's inherently how reality works, though it might be, but rather our unconscious is looking for these sort of patterns. We're always looking for patterns, we're always noticing patterns, sometimes consciously, but most of the time unconsciously. So if we're unconsciously always looking for an argument, we're always looking to get into some sort of screaming match because we see so many things that are wrong in the world because of social media, then we're going to go through our everyday life carrying this reactive anger that we've seen on social media, and we're going to take that into our life. So now our resilience and our desensitivity to triggers is very, very low. So now one person can say any little thing that you don't necessarily like or agree with, and all of a sudden your day is ruined. But is this any way to live? Is this truly any way to live our lives? To me, it doesn't really make much sense. Because any positive thing that you could do in this world would greatly benefit from you being emotionally regulated and a bit more stoic. The work that you do doesn't benefit from you painting anger onto it. When an artist transmutes their anger into something beautiful, they also have to learn to detach from that anger. And if they were to have fueled that anger in the form of an argument or a conversation or a social media comment battle, then they would have not had that same fuel to create art with. So it's not about negating the fact that we are triggered. It's not about suppressing our anger or our emotions. It's about realizing that those emotions don't need to be the leading factor from which we make our decisions in life. Because if we're always acting and deciding things emotionally, then those triggers completely control us. That social media algorithm completely controls us. That person that knows how to get under our skin completely controls us. And again, this is how you lose direction of your life again. This is how you fall back into the unconscious path. Because you're lacking the awareness to see that it's not worth an argument. It's not worth a reaction. It's not worth it. When you encounter a trigger, see it as an actual trigger. For example, triggering a light switch. So these triggers act as launching pads to a more free and a more peaceful mind. Or they can launch pad you the other way. They can launch pad you downwards if you let them. So if we're triggered into feeling fear, if we're triggered into feeling anxiety, and we act as a result of that trigger, we act in a way that is very avoidant, and we act in a certain direction because of that anxiety and fear, we allow it to make the choices in our life, then we're going to become launch padded down into that same unconscious path again. And I know I'm mentioning the unconscious path a lot, but it's worth mentioning because it's very easy and simple to not fall into that unconscious path, but the actual act of breaking through and being brave enough to sit with that discomfort is difficult. But it's extremely necessary because the other side of the coin is something very unrewarding and very unsatisfactory that we're going to feel in our lives. So the real choice to make is to remain calm, remain balanced, and acknowledge the emotion that we were triggered into feeling without letting it make our choices for us going forward. And this is also a way to show to our minds that we are growing and that we are evolved past this certain trigger, this certain fear, this certain anxiety. In the same way of the second example I gave, it works the same way with anger. It works the same way with resentment or jealousy or guilt or any negative emotion. Just because you're triggered into feeling it doesn't mean you are meant to exist in that state for the day or for the week or whatever else. Just because it comes up doesn't mean now it's a whole thing. Just because the emotion is there and just because it exists doesn't mean we have to surrender ourselves to it. We can exist in a calm state of being. We can notice it, we can observe it, and we can let it pass as a result of our inaction and our non-reactiveness towards it. And this goes for people who trigger us or content that triggers us. But most of all, this goes for our inner world where our own thoughts and our own sort of anxieties and fears are triggering us. They too will pass if we just let them. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you're listening on Spotify, thank you. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe as always. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.